Following the plane crash that brought her to Great Bear Island and the events of the Night of the Lights, the night the town of Milton would die in a fiery blaze, Astrid Greenwood would find herself in a dangerous situation involving a group of prisoners that were on their way to Black Rock Penitentiary. After surviving a bloody fight from the schoolhouse to the collapsed tunnel, she found herself stuck between a rock and a hard place. She climbed up and into the crushed prison bus and left behind the word perseverance in her own blood. She was confident that Will Mackenzie would find it and her. With no choices left, she somehow crawled through the collapsed tunnel, escaping the dead mountain town. On the other side, she made her way through the wilderness of Great Bear Island. After crawling her way through another collapsed tunnel further down the road, she would eventually fall unconscious, slowly dying from blood loss and hypothermia. This is where Astrid's story almost ended. This is The Long Dark, Wintermute Episode 3, Crossroads Elegy. A raven croaks in the distance, alerting a nearby person. This was the moment several hours later when Molly would find Astrid nearly frozen to death near the collapsed Keeper's Pass tunnel. Dragging Astrid to her nearby farmstead, Molly was able to save her just in time. Days would pass and she would awaken. Molly described the situation to Astrid, including her injuries, the power outage, and the wolves. She also noted that all electronics were not working, and only the pre-electronic landline and rotary phones were working. After briefly explaining her situation with the plane crash and Will, Molly would leave to hunt for food, and Astrid would fall asleep. Later, Molly would return with venison, and Astrid would awaken to the sound of a tea kettle. From there, the two would converse. Astrid explained more about her circumstances and why she was on Great Bear Island. She desperately needed to find Will and the hard case. She needed to get to Perseverance Mills. She asked Molly why she locked her into the house. This is where the conversation between the two spirals. She was essentially locked in. Astrid asked about a husband. The house was massive, so she assumed it was the case. Her assumption triggered Molly, which caused her to leave to be alone and think. Left alone, Astrid would explore the house to find a broken rifle, a picture of Molly with a man, and a suspicious piece of torn cloth. Molly would call over the rotary phone to say she was in trouble and needed Astrid's help. In the basement of the house, she would find a weapon, ammunition, and a corpse. A short tremor shook the house and revealed the dead body of the man that was in the photo with Molly. This was her husband. Following the blizzard line to the nearby barn, Astrid would fight through the wolves to find that Molly was nowhere to be found. Instead, Molly had found her bow and fought her way out. She called Astrid, which allowed her a chance to ask about the body. Furious, Molly insisted that she stay out of her business. Now that she was free, Astrid would find a lead on a local settlement, Thompson's Crossing. On the opposite side of the valley, Astrid would find the town of Thompson's Crossing. At the town community center was a large bonfire leaving a trail of smoke to follow. Inside, she would come across Father Thomas, the priest for the local church. He would greet Astrid, welcoming her in to rest from the crash. This confused Astrid considering she was in a plane crash several days ago. The crash she was referring to was a few days ago as well, but it was carrying many passengers. Astrid assured to him that she was in a plane crash, but a different one, and that she was fine. He invited her to keep warm regardless of her condition. Father Thomas recounted the story of the last few days to her, which started with a great blizzard. This forced the half-dozen residents of the town to huddle together in the community center to keep warm. That was 1 or 2 days before the first flare. With the first flare would come the power outages. After the first flare, a plane crashed, bringing in survivors over the course of an additional day or two. With the weather the way it was and various road collapses isolating the valley, there was virtually no chance of getting out. Nature had to take its course. Despite having survived a plane crash, heavy bleeding, and hypothermia, Astrid was the only hope for these survivors. She would offer her medical services to help them as best as she could. One of the survivors, Dimitri, was a diabetic and would need insulin. She alerted Father Thomas of the impending medical emergency if they didn't find any soon. He knew of no sources of insulin except for the insulin that Dimitri would have brought with him on the plane. He tasked her with finding the insulin and any survivors at the plane crash. Additionally, he requested her to bring back something that would identify the crash victims that did not make it. This would provide some help with the grieving process for the survivors. He offered his rosary to be carried while she traveled, which would be his way of being present with any survivors in case she found one. While not religious, Astrid took it with her. Another phone call came in, allowing Molly to speak with Astrid again. She was surprised that Astrid was alive and asked if she planned to help the crash survivors. She assumed that since Astrid was a doctor, that she would do anything in her power to save them. With little time to spare, Astrid needed to head out. Molly mentioned a gift that she left behind in the playground, which would assist her with the wolves. In the western hills of the valley, Astrid would find the wreckage of the fallen plane. A passenger airliner had crashed into the valley following the electromagnetic pulse of the first flare. In the crash site, she would find the many passengers that did not make it. She would gather the ID cards from these bodies and the insulin for Dimitri. At the very end of the crash site, she would find a lone survivor, Gwen. All she could say to Astrid was that she wanted to die, that she wanted her pain to end. Astrid wasn't going to let her die. In a flashback sequence, Astrid recalls a memory from her days at the Seraphim Sleep Research Center. She was working but was interrupted by a phone call from a stranger. The woman on the call knew Astrid and what she was working on. Astrid had told them not to call her at work. The stranger warned Astrid that things were getting worse and they needed help. The stranger needed something that was in development at Seraphim, but it was in a secure place. Astrid promised to help but couldn't just take it. The stranger asked if she had contacted Will. Will, her ex-husband, would be able to fly her to the stranger's location. He would be her ticket to Great Bear Island. This cure to an unknown illness plaguing the town of Perseverance Mills was the reason why Will and Astrid would be stranded on the island following the first flare. With Gwen slowly dying, Astrid needed to move fast. She would carry her down the hills towards the river. There, a phone would ring at a burned-down cabin. As usual, Molly would be on the other side. She had been spying on Astrid as she was rescuing Gwen. She also asked if she would tell her more about Will. Astrid asked about her husband, so now Molly wanted to ask the same. She admitted that the man in the basement was her husband, and that she intentionally let him die to a wolf attack. Astrid makes it a point that her intention to let him die was no different than murder. From there, the conversation ends. Finally, after crossing the valley with Gwen over her shoulders, they arrived at the community center. Gwen would be placed down to rest. Dimitri would receive the life-saving insulin he needed. The rest of the crash survivors would receive the ID cards from their family members and friends that did not make it. The pain from their grief would be immeasurable, but this small reminder of their loved ones would help them heal. Those that did not receive an ID card would request that Astrid find the survivor before they died. Now that Astrid had helped the current group of survivors as best as she could, it was Father Thomas's turn to help them. While he would keep them warm, feed them, pray for the dead, and console the survivors, Astrid would continue her work. Father Thomas predicted more blizzards would come considering it was that time of the year. They needed food and supplies to survive the winter. Astrid would work towards securing the future of these survivors, as well as finding the 3 that were still missing. With Gwen rescued, Dimitri stabilized, and the grieving survivors given a memento of their loved ones, Astrid still had a lot of work to do. The community center survivors needed supplies to survive the long, harsh winter. The 3 missing survivors also needed to be rescued. Along the way, Astrid would find the many secrets and mysteries hidden away as well as the missing survivors. While the massive valley offered many dangers, the timber wolves would be the greatest obstacle between certain death and salvation. Upon fully supplying the community center and rescuing the final survivors, Father Thomas would provide his thanks and wisdom. Astrid needed to get to Perseverance Mills. Despite being trapped by avalanches and timberwolves on all sides, there was another route, through the mountains separating the valley and the highway. Astrid mentioned that if things were bad in the valley, they would be worse in Perseverance Mills. She stops herself before saying more, a hint for what awaited her there. Her journey ahead would take her through the Cinder Hills coal mine, an echo of the valley's prosperous past. Through the mine, out the other side, along the coastline highway going north, and eventually, she would reach her destination. Before her departure, Father Thomas brought up the idea of burdens. He could sense hers were weighing on her. Will, the hard case, Perseverance Mills. The secrets she carried over her shoulders didn't have to be carried alone. Father Thomas was suggesting that maybe God could be the answer to her struggles. While she wasn't religious, he intended not to convince her. Instead, he warned her not to let her burdens consume her. The rosary he gave her, like before, would be his way of being with her, in case she needed someone or something to turn to. On her way out of the community center, Molly would call again. This time, she would question Astrid's choices. Would the survivors she rescued do the same for her? Why did she work so hard, and did she get any recognition for her work? Astrid wanted to know why she was asking this. Molly wanted to be something. More than what she was. Much more than just a supportive wife to her husband. Astrid agreed that she could have been much more. Molly explained how she made herself smaller so her husband could feel bigger. She felt her value as a person slip away into nothing, all for his satisfaction. Astrid asked if he had hurt her, and once again questioned if she killed him. Molly said there are many ways to hurt someone, including ways that may never heal. She confirmed once again that the wolves were what killed him. Despite opening herself up for Astrid to analyze, this wasn't what Molly called her for. She wanted to offer information about the Signal Hill radio station. There, she could potentially call Perseverance Mills and ask if Will was there. Astrid asked why she waited this long to tell her. Molly explained she wasn't sure if it would work. She also confessed her loneliness. She appreciated Astrid for their conversations. At Signal Hill, Astrid would learn that the radio was dead. Just like everywhere else in the valley, there was no electricity. Before her trip to the mine, she decided to rest. After some time, she would awaken to the lights of the radio station under an aurora. Eventually, she would pick up a signal from Perseverance Mills requesting help. This conversation would reveal to Astrid that Will was indeed alive and he was on his way there. This was the same radio call that Will had on the radio at Jeremiah's cabin after his victory over the Old Bear and before his departure for Signal Hill. The person requesting help mentioned a quarantine situation, and they were seemingly speaking to someone else, not Will or Astrid. Determined to reach Perseverance Mills and reunite with Will, she prepares herself for the long journey ahead. For the last time, Molly calls Astrid. This time, she wanted to tell Astrid that they both had a lot in common. They both abandoned their men, they were alone, and they were running from their past. Molly confessed everything to her. She had wanted to kill her husband before, mostly for the way he made her feel like her life meant nothing. She could never do it. The wolves did, and she froze with the gun in her hand. He begged her to shoot, but didn't. The wolves might have killed him, but she might as well have done it herself. The reason why she told Astrid all of this was so someone knew that she didn't regret her decision. Now she was confident enough to do what she couldn't do before. The convict outside the radio station and the many others that could be found across the valley were her handiwork. Molly wanted revenge for her suffering. Any man that came across her would be in danger. She wanted payback for the treatment that women have faced throughout history. She asked Astrid if Will was one of the good ones. Astrid hoped to never find him with an arrow in the back. Molly hoped to never run into him. Revenge may not be the answer that Molly was looking for, but at least Astrid could take away the loneliness, even just for a moment. Across the valley, Astrid would find the long-closed Cinder Hills coal mine. Inside, her trip would be complicated by a tremor, similar to the many that had been shaking the valley during her time there. One quake would cause the mine to collapse onto her. Thanks to another aurora outside, the lights in the mine would awaken her. She would heal her injuries and continue forward. With the aurora lighting the mine, new dangers would be presented. Eventually, she would find an elevator on the other side. After repairing the fuse boxes in the mine, the elevator would finally function. This would be the end of her long journey to escape the valley, which was far from a pleasant place.
What the hell?
On the outside of the mine, Astrid would find herself on the coastal highway. There, she would witness the beginning of the end. Ever since the first flare, the night that would spark the quiet apocalypse, the Earth itself had been changing rapidly. First it was the electricity, then the wolves. Now, with the beaching of the world's majestic sea creatures and the rapid changes in the weather, Astrid was sure that something was wrong. That Mother Nature was crying out, or maybe she was warning everyone. Astrid feared what would happen to the people, the ones she left behind. People like Molly, Father Thomas, or the crash survivors. People with their traumas, fears, and grief. What would this new world do to them? Will they persevere, or will they be broken? She didn't know. What she did know was that Will was out there on his way to Perseverance Mills, and she was too. Even if she couldn't stop the darkness of the quiet apocalypse, she wasn't going to give up. It is clear though that she understands that this changing world was more than just the auroras. These changes are the coming apocalypse to the quiet apocalypse. The first flare was only the start. An elegy is a sad poem or song, especially remembering someone who has died or something in the past. The crossroads may refer to the literal crossroad at the core of Thompson's Crossing. It may also be due to the critical choices that were made, whether it was Molly choosing to let her husband die, Father Thomas sheltering the crash survivors, or Astrid convincing Will of her desperate need to get to Great Bear Island. These choices have altered the lives of many people. Together, Crossroads Elegy is both a reflection of past choices and in memory of the unfortunate souls that did not make it to the other side of the quiet apocalypse. If you want to catch up on any lore I've already covered, you can check out all the various playlists for the history of the Long Dark, Wintermute, Rudiger's Project, the people and places of Great Bear Island, and the Buffer Memories. They will be linked in the description. If you enjoyed this lore video for the Long Dark, please don't forget to comment, like, share, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so I can keep making them.